Hello and welcome to Drydock episode 140. This week the questions are taken from guide 200. Yeah, we actually reached 200, believe it or not, a little way back. The USS Tennessee, or the Tennessee class, and the accompanying Wednesday video on HMS Belfast. We Say No to Pay to Win says, I've just noticed that on a couple of pictures of the Tennessees there are markings all along the sides of the turrets. The only other time I can remember seeing these was on the Invincible class battle cruisers, where numbers are painted along the entire side of the turret. Why was this done? Well, you can see the markings here on the superfiring turrets in this wonderful shot of USS California. These are what are called deflection markings, and the idea of these is that if the target is obscured, or for whatever reason you can't take a bearing on it, maybe through combat damage, maybe just through gun smoke being in the way, or fog, or whatever, or even perhaps in rather more close quarters if you're coming round an island and there's a ship ahead of you that's already come round, you can look at the turret of the ship ahead of you and those markings will correspond to where the turret is pointing. So you can get some idea of where to point your own guns without actually having to have visual line of sight to the target in question. This could be very helpful in a battle line for obvious reasons, with gun smoke and ship smoke and smoke screens and so forth, in getting your guns set up and ready to go. This is the same reason you sometimes see those odd looking clocks on the masts of ships that only seem to go up to 10. So they're not time clocks, they're effectively the same thing, they're just another way of displaying to other ships in the battle line where that ship is aiming. And it may not be entirely to help you target the same ship as them. It may also, depending on the circumstances, be to stop you targeting the same ship as them. Because remember, in the Battle of Jutland there were a number of problems, and at Dogger Bank as well, where ships would accidentally engage the wrong target and thus leave an enemy target unengaged, plus often mistaking another ship's shell splashes for their own. These deflection markings give you an ability to, because you know now where the ship ahead of you, or possibly behind you, is pointing its guns, then you can check your own bearings, and if they're coinciding on the same ship, then you know, okay, we are targeting the same ship. Should I be doing that? Possibly not. Maybe I need to target a different vessel. So they do have a number of fairly useful applications in situations where there are going to be multiple targets. Josh Thomas Moore asks, if the domestic enemy for the Imperial Japanese Navy was the Japanese Army, and the US Navy's main enemy was US Congress, what was the Royal Navy's main enemy that wasn't a foreign power? And that one's a fairly easy one, the RAF. Yeah, the RAF, as probably most of you all know, took over or was given control of the Fleet Air Arm for the majority of the interwar period, which is in some part responsible for the state of the Fleet Air Arm in terms of both numbers and types of aircraft that it had going into World War II, although there are obviously other factors involved there which I've commented on in the past. But one of the great missed opportunities, I think, was this aircraft, or a variant thereof, which was in response to a couple of different Air Ministry specifications for a naval fighter in the late 30s. This is, as you probably might guess, the Supermarine entry. And yes, it is based very, very heavily on the Spitfire. It's effectively a properly navalised Spitfire, and you might recognise there's a slight gull wing there, somewhat reminiscent, or I guess precognizant, of the F4U Corsair. So this was a Spitfire design that was completely reworked from the ground up to be properly navalised. So it was strong, it would last, it had wider landing gear, etc. So it would have been a much superior aircraft to operate from carriers as compared to, say, the Seafire, which is literally a land-based Spitfire, just with a few sort of minimum modifications needed to get the thing working on a carrier, and had an annoying tendency to break a lot. This thing wouldn't have. Additionally, the Supermarine submission for the second stage of this particular set of Air Ministry specifications was looking at mounting a Griffon engine in the Spitfire actually earlier than the RAF was looking at doing so. They also looked at an alternative with a Sabre engine, which, for those of you who aren't aware, the Sabre engine is the engine that they put in the Typhoon and the Tempest, which are considerably larger aircraft than a Spitfire. And the top-end Sabres, towards the end of the war, also therefore had a bit more power than a Griffon did. Unfortunately, this wonderful plan, which could have given the Fleet Air on probably the world's best carrier-based fighter aircraft in probably late 41, something like that, armed with 420mm cannon, as well as being, a Spitfire with a socking great engine on the front. Unfortunately, that all got cancelled because with the Battle of Britain, the RAF demanded that basically every Merlin engine and every Spitfire or Spitfire derivative airframe needed to go into the Battle of Britain, which is somewhat understandable, but still deprived the Navy of potentially an absolutely superb single-seat fighter. Or there were some two-seat versions designed as well, because obviously navigation was still a thing that the Royal Navy was worried about. But yeah, can you imagine the incidents in the Mediterranean in late 41, early 42, if instead of full Mars, the Fleet Air Arm was lofting properly navalised sea fires, I guess, at that point, with Griffon engines, or shall we say, how do point defence missions go in the late war if you've got either a late model Griffon engined properly navalised sea fire, or heaven forbid some absolute genius has slapped a late war Sabre engine onto a Spitfire airframe, at which point I think you've possibly invented the world's first VTOL fighter. Granted, it's going to have an operational range at full power of about 100 miles, but that thing's going to climb like a surface-to-air missile. Robo Slacker asks, how would you rank the torpedoes of each navy in World War II? That is something that I think, even to be honest, even a Wednesday video would probably only barely scratch the surface of, because there are just so many torpedoes. It's not just that literally everybody who's taking part has torpedoes. The British, American, French, Italian, German, Russian, Japanese navies all have their own torpedoes, and there's a bunch of, obviously, the smaller navies also have their own torpedoes, and within each of those categories you have submarine launched torpedoes, which are usually, and I say usually, 21-inch torpedoes. You've then got airdrop torpedoes, which are usually, again, most of the time, 18-inch torpedoes. You have a few heavyweights, like the ones aboard the Nelson class and the Japanese Long Lances. And then you have ones in various weird shapes and forms. Then you've got electrically powered torpedoes, conventionally powered torpedoes, oxygen-fueled torpedoes, homing torpedoes, weaving torpedoes. And within the airdropped, ship-launched and submarine launched, you've got various different makes and models of torpedoes as well. So ranking all of those, that would be a job and a half. But if you want to look at, let's say we'll just take a very broad look at torpedoes in general, then for the most part, looking at the 5 big navies that are really using them a lot, so Italy, Germany, Japan, Britain and America, the Italian torpedoes are largely serviceable. Some of their weirder experiments don't go quite so well. The main thing to note about the Italian torpedoes is some of them are actually exceptionally fast. And remember, it's the Italian torpedo design for the streamlined warhead that the Japanese copy to get extra speed out of the Long Lance. The Japanese torpedoes, obviously, they have the Long Lance, they have the preceding Type 90, they have the Long Lance derivative Type 95. There's a lot that's been said about them. They're good, they're very good, they're fast, they're long range, they've got, especially in the case of the Long Lance, an unusually powerful explosive warhead, mainly just because of sheer size. Their main drawback especially with the Type 95 and Type 93, the Long Lance itself plus the submarine-based derivative, is varying degrees of use of oxygen, which can leave them as something of a safety hazard. But other than that, they're pretty top tier the whole way through. The Germans, Their torpedoes are, again, pretty solid. They have probably the second worst problems with faulty detonators at the beginning of the war, especially magnetic detonators. And to be clear, everyone has this problem. The Japanese and the Italians, not as much as the Germans, the British, and the Americans, but they still have problems. It's just a matter of how badly. The Germans are kind of second worst for the problems, but they're also relatively quick on fixing them. The British are generally pretty solid throughout. Their torpedoes, for the most part, aren't absolute top of the pack, but they're also usually not bottom of the pack either, and they're also around about middling when it comes to problems with magnetic detonators. Famously, you have the issue with the initial accidental attack on Sheffield really being saved only by faulty magnetic detonators, but you can see partly the adaptation that's in place by the fact that those swordfish land. They say these torpedoes don't work, and the next flight they make, which is the one that attacks Bismarck, they're not using magnetic detonators anymore. They're using just the contact detonators. So pretty solid all round, with the sort of unusual feature, of course, of the Mark 8 torpedo still being around in the 1980s, being used to sink the General Belgrano. The Americans start off with the worst possible torpedoes. Shock, I know, with the Mark 14s because of their dreadful issues, and the fact that the Mark 15s, the ship-launched ones, and the Mark 13s, the air-dropped ones, share a number of similar components and have a number of similar issues, even when the components aren't shared, really, really does not help. But the flip side to that, and we're ignoring for a minute things like acoustic homing torpedoes and such, because they really are all in a little class of their own, and again, it's a subject for a much longer video, but having said that, but with the American torpedoes, once those issues are fixed, and they do take a while to fix, but once they are, the Mark 14 is a perfectly solid torpedo for submarines. The use of certain kinds of explosive, especially by the Allies, also helps with that, but as a weapon in and of itself, as a platform for delivering boom to your enemy, the Mark 14's a pretty solid weapon once it's actually fixed. It just takes time. Similarly with the Mark 15, although Mark 15 malfunctions save as many US ships as they end up causing losses for in various engagements, as you've probably seen going through the Guadalcanal series. And then you get to the Mark 13, which is just an abysmal weapon because of its various malfunctions at the start of the war, but by the end of the war it's gone completely to the other end of the scale with this crazy ability they have to lob them from effectively, not quite, but almost cruising altitudes and speeds. And in fact, they can lob them at a speed such that the Avenger has to dive to get up to that speed if they really want optimal drop speeds. So, yeah, the Japanese start strong and stay strong. The Italians are okay the whole way through with a notable bit of speed. The British are pretty solid the whole way through. The Germans start out a little bit weak, pick up fairly quickly. They do all right for most of the rest of the war. Some very nice innovations towards the end. The Americans start at absolute bottom of the pack, but have this massive whiplash through sort of late 43, early 44, once everything's fixed and they're getting bedded in with their tactics, where their torpedoes go from trash to actually pretty darn good. I mean, some of the Mark 14 issues are fixed before that, but the development of tactics, and especially the Mark 13 airdrop, is more of a late war thing, so I'm kind of aggregating in that respect. So yeah, that's a quick summary, at least in my opinion, of torpedoes in World War II. Muffin Man asks, you often mention 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, etc. rate ships of the line and frigates. Could you give an explanation as to what each tier of ship from the Age of Sail means? So this does come up on a semi-regular basis, and I think I have answered it once or twice before, but to be fair, with 140 Drydocks, I think it can probably stand a quick repeat-recap. So the rating system was come up in the 1700s, the early 1700s, to try and distinguish between various types of ship in a way that actually made sense. Because at the beginning of the 1700s, you could have a ship called and this is just for the Royal Navy, let alone everybody else, you could have Royal Ship, Great Ship, Great Royal ship, frigate, Great Frigate, second rank ship, first rank ship. Few people were still talking about galleons, and there was nothing really that told you how these stacked up. I mean, HMS Sovereign of the Seas, for instance, which by the later ratings would be a first rate, was sometimes called a great ship, sometimes it was called a royal ship, sometimes it was called a frigate. None of that is very helpful. So, what they decided to do, what's called the Establishment of 1706, they set out a series of weight, displacement, size, gun power, gun type, etc. specifications, and they said, right, anything that falls into this category and ideally is to this specification going forward is a first rate, second rate, etc., etc. Some of that didn't quite work out. Trying to completely uniform, make uniform all the certain capital ships and other warships by saying it must be of exactly this size, etc. That didn't work very well. But the gun rating did. So the gun rating was eventually adopted. There were various modifications to the establishments through the 1700s. Then they were quietly dropped, but the rating system itself stayed. And that rating system, at least towards the end of the period of the Napoleonic Wars, which is when you most commonly hear about it, was defined roughly as follows. You have first rates, which are your big ships of the line. They stay with your home fleet. They're the ones that lead and fight, help fight your biggest, most important battles. They're admirals' flagships, and you don't have very many of them. I mean, the Royal Navy, even at the height of the Napoleonic Wars, rarely had more than half a dozen at any one time. And these first rates are 100 guns or more, 3 gun decks, or in Santissim and Trinidad's case, 4. Then you have second-rate ships of the line. So these are 90 to 98 gun ships, also 3-deckers, but as the gun rating suggests, slightly smaller. You might find these on foreign stations, etc., because they're not seen as quite the same as hold back in case of emergency in home waters type ships. And when I say home waters, that's a somewhat broad meaning, because you'd find Royal Navy first rates in the Mediterranean, you'd find them in the Caribbean, etc. It was basically a case of if we need to send them there, we will, but we want them to come back eventually. Whereas with the second rate could spend years out, I don't know, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and that could be its home base. Then you've got the third rate, which is 70 to 88 guns. In the Royal Navy, at the Napoleonic War period, the third rate is most commonly a 74. In the Franco-Spanish forces, it's quite often a 78 or 80 gun ship. These are your workhorse capital ships. They make up the vast majority of the fleets on both sides at Trafalgar, and you can also find them on independent cruising stations, in squadrons. Basically, if you see a capital ship in the Age of Sail, it's almost certainly going to be a third rate simply by law of statistics, and they're 2-deckers. You then have the fourth rate. The fourth rate is a bit of a weird one, because at the beginning of the rating system, the fourth rate, which is 50 to 68 guns, also a 2-decker, is actually a ship of the line. It's expected to stand in the line of battle. There are still a few of them around towards the latter part of the Age of Sail. HMS Agamemnon's a good example, a 64-gunner. But they are being phased out of the line of battle quite quickly in the latter part of the 1700s, because they no longer have the size or the firepower to stand in the line. And whilst a 64, 68 gunner might not be too far away numerically wise from a 74, the 74 is probably carrying 32 pounders on its lower gun decks. The fourth rates quite often would carry a maximum of 24 pounders. So fourth rates tended to get, in the Napoleonic era, very rapidly demoted to foreign station ships, occasionally leading or heading up small squadrons, and also quite a number of them were rasade down. So HMS Indefatigable, for example, is a rasade down fourth rate. As a result, the fourth rate also, at the lower end of things, tends to become something more akin to a heavy frigate than anything else. But then you get to the official frigates. So you've got fifth rates, which are 30 to 48 gun ships, and those are your heavy frigates. Quite often, 32-gunner ships are quite common. 40-plus guns are relatively less common, but say the US-6 frigates, at least the big ones like Constitution, are notionally at least 40-plus gun ships, depending on exactly what period you're looking at. Depends on exactly how many guns they're pierced for. They're your bigger long-range frigates. You see them a lot cruising around the world. A lot of frigate actions are fought by those ships. Then you've got sixth rates, which are 20 to 28 gun ships. Also frigates, but somewhat smaller. Again, kind of like with the fourth rates, somewhat less capable as well, because not only are they carrying fewer guns, they're also generally carrying lighter guns. And then anything below that is an unrated ship. It might be a brig, it might be a sloop, it might be a snow, it might be a gunboat, whatever, but they're no longer rated ships. The rated ships would be expected to be in battle, in major battles. The first through fourth rates, apart from right at the end when it's just first through thirds, they're in the line of battle. Fifth and sixths are going to be towing crippled ships, doing scouting and signalling duties, but not expected to actually fight the enemy. First, second, third, and occasionally fourth rates in a straight-up engagement in the midst of a pell-mell battle like Trafalgar or Cape St. Vincent or whatever. And just one final note on those, that rating is the number of guns of what they call the ship is pierced for, i.e. if you went around the ship and you counted how many gun ports does this ship have, that is its rating. Almost all ships, especially in the Napoleonic War period, had more guns than that. So if you had, say, carronades on your weather deck or something like that, they don't have a gun port for them, and also they're not long guns, so quite often they would not be counted. Some specialist long guns that were mounted on the bow as chasers, if they were mounted high in the bow and they didn't have their own gun port, again, would not be counted. So when you look at something like, say, Constitution, which, depending on exactly when in its lifespan it is somewhere in the low to high 40s of guns officially, is actually carrying something in sort of the 50s, maybe even the low 60s of guns, depending on the exact time period, if you actually count for every single anti-ship cannon or carronade it has on board. And its opponents are similarly armed. So let's say Java, for example, or Guerriere, they're notionally low 30 gun ships. They're actually carrying something like 40, low to mid 40s in terms of guns, and obviously Constitution is carrying a bit more as well. Victory, 104 gunner, but actually carrying slightly more than that at Trafalgar, and so on and so forth. So hopefully that's a relatively short but comprehensive guide to the rating system. Then, what classified documents are you most looking forward to being declassified? And further to that, will any controversial information come to light regarding the sinking of HMS Glorious? Well, by their very nature, I don't know what's in the classified documents. But yeah, broadly speaking, I think there is going to be an awful lot exciting coming out for World War II historians generally, naval historians as well, in the next 10 to 15 years, assuming we're not all, riding through the post-apocalyptic landscape, merrily or not, as the case may be, in 10 to 15 years. But nevertheless, that's because of, in the UK, a thing called what we call at the moment the 90-year rule. So it's rules about disclosure, stuff that's really secret. A lot of it, especially when it relates to individuals, is classified under a rule, at least for that time period, that says we assume that the restriction period will be the lifespan of that person, which is assumed to be 100 years, minus a figure that is calculated based on the age of the people involved. And that's obviously going by the youngest person involved. So if you've got an incident where, I don't know, a 40-year-old general is involved, but a bunch of people who are 18-year-old recruits, 18, 20-year-old recruits are involved as well, then the restriction period will be 82 years from the time of that incident, not 60. But because there are obviously so many recruits and such like, and for that period it kind of goes by decades, at least going by the National Archives release documents and guidance, it's basically the rule of thumb of about 90 years for the 1940s. Now, of course, that means the 2030s, but given that most of the time people would be over 18 or assumed to be at least over 16, it actually shaves a few years off of that. And, of course, not every classified incident is going to involve everyone down to like the 18, 20-year-olds. It may just involve some older people. So effectively starting a few years ago and going through now and going on for the next 5 to 10 years, I expect there's going to be a fairly significant run of very restricted files that will now be becoming public. Which naval historians manage to find which ones have actually been declassified, because they don't make a massive song and dance about it usually, and then jump on it and publish it. They're going to have some nice papers going. Who knows, maybe even I'll be one of them. Depends how predatory you want to get with the Q archives and other places. But all of that aside, what am I most looking forward to being declassified? I think some of the stuff surrounding the really dark days of the naval war, so the Mediterranean in late 41 and early 42, the U-boat campaign in mid-43, that kind of thing. Those, I think, are going to be really interesting. Because, I mean, you look at the amount of deception effort that went in at the time to convincing the Italians that Queen Elizabeth and Valiant were still completely operational. There's got to be a lot of stuff that's hidden away. And on top of that, there's going to be an awful lot of stuff. The stuff that I'm most excited for is stuff that I don't know about. And stuff that no one knows about. Because you think about it, for the better part of 50 years, quite how the Allies were able to know so much about U-boat operations and such was a mystery. And then Bletchley Park information was released, and suddenly that completely rewrote how we understood the Battle of the Atlantic to go, and a number of other incidents. So there's probably other similar things like Bletchley Park that are sitting there waiting to explain or partially explain really strange things that we don't necessarily understand or can't figure out or can't quite discern what the reasoning for was. And there's probably a whole bunch of really secret operations as well. I mean, we know about stuff like the X-craft that we used to attack turpits and so forth, but if that's the stuff we've publicly been told about, and given that a lot of those special operations did involve people who were in their sort of late teens, early 20s, etc., there may well be a bunch of really cool secret stuff that happened that we're still not being told about, but may vastly change our understanding of certain elements of the war. ZJ517 asks, this is the first time I've heard about the B-bomb. What is its development history, and did any nation actually field the weapon? Oh, I do love this weapon. It's such a delightful engineering solution to a problem, and also one that really doesn't get anywhere near the amount of appreciation that it does for its innovation. So the B-bomb actually starts off, believe it or not, in the late 1920s. And the fundamental principle, as you can see from this diagram, it's also called the Mark IV bomb, is you drop a weapon and its fuse is activated, not actually initiated, but just activated on hitting the water. It then sinks, and as you can see, it has a rather blunt, actually concave head, which is designed to help with hydrodynamics, as opposed to aerodynamics. And then it has a buoyant chamber in the back, which you can see labelled there. It then floats back up again, and the idea is you drop this bomb, or a line of these bombs, in front of a ship. And so this, to a certain extent, actually compromises their ability to evade, because if you've got a bunch of them, you can drop them in a long line, and then it doesn't matter which way they go, they're going to run over at least one. Once its inertia runs out and the buoyancy takes over, the bomb heads back up to the surface, and if it hits something on the way, it goes boom. Now, this is a slightly complicated way of giving aircraft the ability to detonate explosives under the keel of ships, bypassing the torpedo defense system and putting a hole, fairly substantial hole, in a ship in a place where a ship really doesn't want to have a hole. At first, in the late 1920s, the idea for this thing is a 2,000-pound bomb, which obviously not all of that weight is going to be explosive, but it basically means, for the time period, setting off an amount of explosive that's probably about 3 times as much as the average torpedo warhead, right under the ship in an area where there's no real possibility for any kind of torpedo defense system beyond the usual double bottoming of a ship, so nowhere near as resistant as the side bulges, etc., which would be utterly devastating for practically any ship. They did tests on rigs and mock-ups, and the results were utterly devastating for any kind of warship. There was no defense. There were only 2 problems with it. One, with a 2,000-pounder, especially in the late 20s, good luck carrying more than one, and good luck carrying it on anything other than a strategic bomber. So it gradually gets sized down to 1,000 pounds to 500 pounds, and then to this iteration, which is the one that actually goes into service in the late 1930s, which is a 250-pounder, of which about 110 pounds is explosive. Now, at this point, the warhead has, dropped below the weight of the average torpedo, but it's still hitting the ship right in the underside, bypassing pretty much all torpedo defense, so that balances out. And obviously it has the potential to do an awful lot of damage, especially if it comes up right in the middle of the ship, because obviously even if a torpedo defense system fails, the engines are usually clustered as close as they can towards the center line of the ship. If this thing comes in underneath, it's going to go potentially straight into the engines or straight into the magazines, bypassing all that depth of ship that has been constructed specifically to absorb flooding and fragments and etc., even if it bypasses the torpedo defense system. But regardless, this weapon, as I say, does go into service in 1939. It is in active use. The problem that they run into, however, is that to drop it you need a specific bomb sight, which is a fairly new one to get everything working properly. And that's a fairly rare bomb sight, and in the end you just see torpedoes and regular bombs and depth charges being used instead for the most part. Unfortunately, my research, at least so far, there are a few documents I do want to chase up in the National Archives when I can get back to them, but my research so far kind of runs into a bit of a, not a dead end, but just kind of runs out once you get to the actual wartime service. So I haven't been able to find any particular successes of the weapon, apart from the fact that, say, the fact it is in service and the fact that there is mention of this specific bomb sight being required tells me it is actually being used in some manner. But yeah, that's where so far I'm out of information. But the development process from the late 20s to the late 30s is quite fascinating, and the concept is spot on and ahead of its time. It's basically the same kind of concept that underlies the reason for the magnetic detonating torpedoes, and earlier the magnetic mines of the late First World War. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if it was used extensively, what successes it got, and if it wasn't particularly successful, why it wasn't particularly successful. I suspect it's probably to do with the timing of things, because you've got to drop it ahead of the ship, you've got to have the ship go across it, and having 250-pounder versions probably helps because you can, as I said, lay a string of them, but you've then got to get it to pop back up again, and the timing of that, if the ship's going at a certain speed, you've got to drop it a certain place ahead, you've actually got to then hit that point ahead, it's then got to rise up correctly and detonate. You're effectively trying to fire a torpedo in some ways in terms of the deflection, but also now in 3D. I mean, yes, a torpedo's in a 3D environment, but the actual firing solution is mostly 2D. So I suspect that's probably why we don't hear too much about it, but we'll see. Tok Teplev asks, can you touch on, please, the subject of the Russian Navy coming into existence during Peter I's rule, or Peter the Great, I guess? How was it perceived by European powers? It seems to have been 0 ships to a full navy in about a decade. The story of the Russian Navy in more detail is something I do want to cover in a Wednesday video at some point. Don't necessarily think I can fit it into one, but if I have to do multiple, I do multiple. It is a very interesting story and one that does often go very underappreciated. However, when it comes to Peter the Great's initial founding of the Russian Navy, and indeed the Russian Navy's general existence for the first couple of hundred years, it kind of falls into two categories. Yeah, the Russians did go from almost nothing to a fairly large advanced navy with a number of advanced tactics very quickly, in part because Peter the Great was a fairly smart ruler. He went to all the nations that he was friendly with who already had navies to learn from them and to steal some of their better naval architects to basically teach him and the new Russian Navy how to build a navy, which is a sensible thing to do. They then took those ideas and ran with them with their own flavour. Now, so when it comes to the Age of Sail Russian Navy, there are two general reactions to it from European powers, and that's to do with the two areas that the Navy is concentrated in. Firstly, down in the Black Sea, which technically actually takes top spot as the original home of the Russian Navy by like 4 years. There, European powers are quite happy to have the Russian Navy around because their main enemy is the Ottomans, and no one in Europe particularly likes the Ottomans, so having another power around who can counterbalance the Ottomans on the naval side of things is... Everyone's like, yeah, great. The Ottomans can worry about the Russians now instead of constantly just focusing on the rest of us in the Mediterranean. Obviously, the Ottomans weren't too thrilled with this, but everybody else was, and you asked about the European powers, so there you go. On the other hand, what we now today would call the Baltic Fleet, people were somewhat less enthusiastic about. The Swedes, for example, not particularly happy with the existence of the Russian Baltic Fleet, but neither were a lot of other navies, mainly because the supplies for certain materials that were quite vital for shipbuilding, especially tall straight timbers for masts, and a certain amount of rigging, spars, yards, and rope, etc., a lot of that stuff came from the Baltic, and having a big Russian fleet present in the Baltic meant that people were a little bit concerned about whether or not they'd still have free access to those supplies. I mean, the Swedes were there, the Danes were there, there were already concerns, but for one thing, neither Sweden nor Denmark was quite as antagonistic towards some other European powers as Russia was, and for the second thing, whilst Sweden and Russia would have an absolutely colossal naval war for quite a while that would go, again, relatively underappreciated and underreported, Sweden and Denmark were not seen as anywhere near the kind of massive threat that Russia could be. And so deals could be cut with the Swedes, and often the Swedes and the Danes were the ones doing the exports, so they had it in their own best interests to cut deals with people. The Russians people a lot more worried about, especially not so much from a perspective of Russia might arbitrarily do this, but in the various European conflicts, which side might Russia pick and then deny the other access to these materials? And that's just for the Age of Sail. I mean, you asked about Peter the Great and the Age of Sail, so that's that. The Russian Navy as an entity, as you get into the latter part of the Age of Sail and into the Ironclad era, people worry - are happy about it for various other reasons, but that's another question for another time. And the Aussie asks, if the Royal Australian Navy had operated an Ark Royal class aircraft carrier in World War II, what engagements would it have been involved with, and what aircraft would it have operated? This would be quite difficult, I think, to work out with any degree of certainty, because historically the Royal Australian Air Force wasn't really that up to date with aircraft until 1941, when suddenly it is given half a dozen to a dozen different types of aircraft, a lot of which are relatively new. Whereas if they've actually got a carrier, and if it's an Ark Royal sister ship, it may well be either have fleet air arm squadrons aboard, or have a similar agreement with the fleet air arm whereby Australian pilots are flying on board but they're getting the same aircraft as the fleet air arm. Or they might go down their entirely own route of trying to develop their own carrier aircraft. It's rather difficult to tell at that point. But for the sake of argument, let's say that they use the same aircraft as the fleet air arm. That seems to be the simplest and easiest one to go for. What engagements would it have been involved with? That is going to depend quite a lot on circumstances, specifically how much Australia keeps it back for its own defence. Because bear in mind, the reason you had things like HMAS Canberra and HMAS Australia available for the Pacific campaign was because Australia was keeping them relatively close, whilst they were happy to send ships like Sydney or Perth or the Scrap Iron Flotilla out to the Mediterranean. Now, if they've got a carrier, given the UK's initial early losses in carriers, I can see the Royal Navy desperately trying to persuade the Australians to send a carrier to help. And in that respect, if the Australians agreed, it would probably be a carrier based out of Alexandria with Admiral Cunningham's units. If that happens, then the Australian carrier is most likely going to participate, assuming it's not badly damaged or destroyed by air assault, in the attack on Taranto, for example. It's going to be a huge help because an Ark Royal type carrier with that many aircraft available to it is going to be massively helpful in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it could tip the balance of the Mediterranean War quite decisively one way or the other. I mean, Matapan ended up in quite a decisive victory for the Royal Navy when you had a single armoured carrier launching penny packet strikes. Imagine if Matapan, assuming the Italians came out, but let's imagine Matapan has fought with both those strikes and the strikes from an Australian Ark Royal type that's got 2-3 squadrons of swordfish aboard. Could change things dramatically. Vittorio Veneto might not escape. And this is where you start to get butterflies that go all over the place. Because if the Australian carrier is in the Mediterranean at the time that war breaks out between Japan and everybody else, it's possible the carrier stays in the Mediterranean for a while, at least for a while, before being pulled back. If it's already in Australia, then it misses out on, or in Australian waters, then it would miss out on those Mediterranean engagements, but would be much more likely to get involved in the early part of the war in the Pacific. Now, whether or not that means she's part of Operation C, don't know. That could have some rather interesting implications as well. Again, because she can launch more scout aircraft, there's a greater chance of picking up Nagumo's fleet, there's a greater chance, therefore, of a nighttime engagement, and of course, with a lot more aircraft, that nighttime engagement might be more decisive. Or Nagumo might find Somerville's fleet, who knows? And then, of course, you've got Coral Sea. I think if Coral Sea happens and the Australian carrier is still around, it's almost certainly going to be involved because, you know, the Japanese are coming for Australia. So there's a whole slew of possibilities for the Australian carrier to be involved in. Obviously, at any point it might get hit and sunk, and that will cut off further involvement in the war. But an awful lot of the places that it could be in early in the war could have a rather decisive potential to tip the balance or to alter the course of the war navally. Say that we've covered the Mediterranean, covered Operation C. Even at Coral Sea, having 3 carrier hulls instead of 2, plus night fighting capability, might allow the battle to continue longer and might turn it from a Japanese tactical victory, but Allied strategic victory, but tactical loss, to maybe the Allies get both the tactical and the strategic victory if they manage to knock off another carrier, or something similar to that. So, yeah, who knows, but it'll be a very, very interesting alternate timeline. Graham R. asks, where exactly did the term frigate originate, and how? Frigate is one of those wonderful terms where the etymology of it basically runs into a brick wall. There's a lot of discussion about what it might mean, but pretty much almost all of the theories have some major flaws. One or two have less flaws, but are still something of a reach. What we do know is that it originates, the English term originates from the French term, which in turn originates from an Italian term, fregata, and no one really knows where fregata came from. That's basically the problem. The earliest account of fregata that we can find in an Italian text is from the 1300s, i.e. the 14th centuries, hilariously enough the period that I do medieval reenactment for. And at that point, fregata refers to a boat that is attached to the admiral's galley and towed behind it. So it's somewhat bigger than just a rowing boat or something like that, but it's not a full-sized warship, otherwise it wouldn't be being towed behind. So it seems to be some kind of very small, lightweight vessel of some description. Almost kind of like how they tried to put torpedo boats in some 19th century warships. But once you get into say, the 1500s, 1600s, and it's manoeuvred its way over into the English language, the term frigate has taken on a new type of meaning, which might be related to that old meaning, but effectively it means a ship that is built for speed and agility. And therefore that it's more of a descriptor rather than a designation. So the usual designation is frigate built. So it in some ways you could almost look at it as an evolution of the race-built galleon as again a description rather than a specific term, because you could have a race-built galleon that's 300 tons displacement, you could have a race-built galleon that's 1,000 tons displacement, and you could have conventional galleons that sit in between those two figures. Similarly, the use of frigate-built or frigate is more descriptive than it is specifically pinning down a certain role at the time that we're talking about. So that's why you see when Sovereign of the Seas has some modifications made to it to improve its stability and it becomes fairly swift and agile for a ship of its size, it's described as a great frigate. It's obviously not a frigate in the sense that we tend to think of frigates, but it is frigate, I guess frigate, not even frigate built because it wasn't built that way, but is frigate-like. It has the properties of a frigate, at least in the minds of the people who are describing it, i.e. it is fast and manoeuvrable. And then the term evolves on from there to mean, small warship that's still rated, and then into the modern parlance where it started out as basically anti-submarine escort warship, and now just means kind of large-ish basically ocean-going modern warship that is smaller than a destroyer, and even that's somewhat contradictory these days. Aerospace Gaming asks, can you explain the main changes made to HMS Dreadnought that made it worthy of consideration as the start of a new era of warships? Once again, this is a question that has come up in the distant past of the Drydock, but again, new listeners, probably worth a quick summary. Dreadnought's main advantage was that it combined a lot of different upcoming features into one ship. It had a decent Krupp steel main armour belt. Some ships already had that. It had central battery director firing control. Again, some ships had that. It had turbine engines. Now, that was a first for big warships. And it also had an all-big gun battery. It didn't have any secondary or intermediate batteries. Some ships had come close, but had still used different lengths of barrel, even if they'd had the same caliber, which still gave it different ballistic properties. So Dreadnought was the first one to have all of its main guns all the same caliber and all the same length, so it had a unified ballistic properties section for its main armament, and to say no intermediate armament. So combining all of those features together made it a brand new start, because it was therefore faster than practically any other battleship. It was as well protected or better than any other battleship. It had a far heavier broadside than any other battleship in terms of its main battery. And thanks to the director firing, it could fire those guns out to a fairly long range, and with that 8-gun broadside, it could also fire partial 4-gun salvos if they wanted to establish the range really quickly, which a pre-Dreadnought couldn't because it only had 4 guns. Ash asks, you've stated that for simplicity you refer to turrets as double, triple and occasionally quadruple, even though that technically refers to turrets where guns are locked together, and separate guns would be 2, 3, or 4 gun. Can you give some examples of ships that had locked together guns and the pros and cons of guns that elevated together versus guns that elevate independently? The primary advantage of a gun system where everything is locked together, so double, triple, or quadruple, in strict technical terms, is that you can group the guns slightly closer together, and you also need a single set of mechanisms for the elevation of the guns. So single set of mechanisms means less chances for something to go wrong. It also means lighter weight, because, one set instead of however many, 2, 3, or 4. And with the guns somewhat close together, although you don't want to get them too close, because otherwise you end up with interference from their shell flight patterns, it also means that the turret overall can be made somewhat smaller, and if the turret is made somewhat smaller, you can then use the same amount of weight for more protection. So you can get a smaller, more compact, therefore slightly harder to hit, and better protected turret, and it's relatively unlikely that something's going to go wrong with the elevation mechanism of your guns. The flip side to that is that if something does go wrong with the mechanism to elevate your guns, your entire turret is out of action. And similarly, if there's an error in loading drill, if there's a problem with a gun, then that's going to hold up the entire turret, as opposed to where a gun can elevate on its own. Then if you're, say, got a triple turret like here on South Dakota, you can still fire 2 guns in that salvo while they're sorting out the third. This gets even worse if you have something like a jam, or you have some kind of mechanical failing that needs to be fixed with the gun, because if that takes place in a gun turret that has all its guns locked together, then that gun is going to be constantly moving as the other guns fire, which is going to be somewhat of a problem for the people who are trying to fix it, because the thing will keep moving, and it weighs a couple of 100 tons. It's not exactly lightweight or going to stop for you. So that can have a lot of problems. As I said, if you do lose the mechanism through mechanical failure or a shell hit, you've also lost the entire turret. Plus, an independently elevating guns, i.e. 2, 3, 4 gun turrets, whilst they do lead to larger turrets, which in theory for the same weight means you have less protection on the turret, that also means that there is more space, more floor space inside the turret itself, and if there's more floor space inside the turret itself, then it becomes slightly easier to load the guns, and therefore you probably actually get slightly more efficient gun working inside. Brian Smith asks, Bismarck versus Yamato. Not in a straight fight though. Which country got more use or value out of these 2 classes of ships as compared to the other class between Germany and Japan? This one is hard to quantify, because if you look at different metrics, you're going to get different results. So if you look at, say, tonnage of ships sunk by these battleships, well, the Bismarcks are going to win that, because the total, even if you assign every single ship that Yamato potentially hit at the Battle of Samar to Yamato completely, all of that tonnage added up together doesn't equal the tonnage of Hood. So the Bismarcks would win that. Then if you look at ships sunk because of them rather than directly by them, again, the Bismarcks would win that particular scenario, because the presence of turpits can be at sea, or at least the rumoured presence thereof, can be almost directly attributed to all of the losses that occurred on the convoy PQ-17. So, compared to how many ships were lost because of a decision made by the US Navy when they heard Musashi and Yamato were at sea, none, really. Maybe you could make an argument that the sinking of Musashi, and thus Kurita briefly turning away, resulting in Task Force 34 not being detached and being kept with Halsey, could be attributed in part to then the Battle of Samar and the loss of various vessels there, but at the same time we run into the same issue of adding all those tonnages up still doesn't add up to even the tonnage that was lost on PQ-17. But then you can look at other things. So, effort expended to sink them. Now, obviously, Bismarck had a lot of Royal Navy ships coming after it, and Tirpitz had many, many visits from the Fleet Air Arm, the RAF, and midget submarines from the Royal Navy and so forth. So there was a lot of effort put into sinking them. Conversely, you can look at the absolutely colossal airstrikes that were sent after Musashi and Yamato in their last two actions, and various other things, torpedoes and shells that were fired at Yamato at Samar, and so on and so forth. And, well, quantifying exactly who had the most explosive or effort thrown at them to sink them is a little bit of a wash, I think. Maybe Tirpitz might edge it out for the Germans, but who knows? It's very different and difficult to calculate, relatively speaking. So how many aircraft do you make equivalent to a battleship, for example? So how many squadrons does a US carrier force have to launch before they put as much effort into sinking Yamato or Musashi as the effort that's entailed simply by Rodney being there? And then you can look at things like actual use. How often did they use these ships? And in that, the Japanese pretty much come out ahead because, well, Bismarck goes out on one voyage, and that's all she wrote. And Tirpitz goes up to Norway, spends a lot of time in Norway, and goes out on combat operations less than half a dozen times. Whereas Yamato and Musashi do actually undertake a fair bit of sailing in support of or in escort of various Japanese naval formations. They're present at Midway, for example, albeit, well, Yamato is present at Midway, albeit somewhat far back. Then you have, obviously, Leyte Gulf, where both of them set out, only one of them returns. You have Tengo, you have various other bits and pieces that they do elsewhere. So in terms of miles on the clock, you could say the Japanese get that one. And in a similar thing, you can almost look at the inverse of that, of what did these things tie down? What other things could they have built instead of these that might have served them a bit better? Well, with the Germans, as I've said before, you could maybe have gotten a couple of Scharnhorsts. Bismarcks didn't actually end up doing all that much actively. A couple more Scharnhorsts, especially with the 15-inch guns, might have been as useful or more useful and would have cost less to build. You could have put all of those resources into building something like U-boats. Now, obviously, it's not, as I've said before, it's not a one-to-one division of tonnage, but you could have gotten a reasonable number of U-boats out of the steel and machinery resources put into Bismarck, for example. Whereas for the Japanese, whilst Scharnhorsts or U-boats might have been very useful for the Kriegsmarine, for the Japanese, they could build a couple more carriers, and I've discussed this as well. Tonnage isn't strictly the problem, it's dock space. So yeah, maybe the Japanese could build another couple of Shokaku class. Whether or not they'd actually have been then able to make use of them because the limited number of air crew and aircraft that the Japanese had available is another open question. But assuming that they could do that, then probably certainly two Shokakus at Midway, or even one Shokaku at Midway instead of Yamato, probably would have been considerably better for the Japanese. But we don't know if they could have actually fully stocked two full-size Shokaku-style aircraft carriers. So you can make an argument that both sets of ships absorbed resources that could have been better spent elsewhere, but picking out, okay, who got the best value out of each? Well, it's 2-1 with a score draw as well to the Bismarcks, but I'll leave you to make your own decisions on that. Admiral Tiberius asks, could the Habakkuk ice ships be useful in the Pacific in the latter stages of the war? I'm thinking their sheer mass would have been especially effective versus the kamikaze threat. That, to be honest, would have been absolutely hilarious. I mean, if it lives up to the reputation that the documentation of the time suggests it has, and stays afloat, and the freezer units are keeping it chilled. Assuming that any of the kamikazes make it through the truly ridiculous anti-aircraft battery they no doubt would have equipped it with, it would have been quite amusing to look on the bridge and off in the distance there's a distant fireball, and then a few minutes later a runner, out of breath, desperately comes up and says, Sir, kamikaze hit on the bow. And the captain, carefully preparing a letter, calls forward another runner and says, okay, Perkins, take this to the governor of Bowlandia and tell him that we have witnessed a tragedy occurring somewhere in his domain, and that he should probably get on to fixing it. That thing would have been ridiculously big. But more seriously, yes, it would have been very useful. It would have been kamikaze central. The main thing you probably would have had to look out for is actually Kai-10. If the anti-submarine screen lets a Kai-10 launching submarine through, those things had a seriously big warhead, to the point that it could even be a problem for something like a Habakkuk. But against kamikazes, yeah, they're just going to take little chunks out that can be easily smoothed over for the most part. And the main advantage of something that size is not necessarily just the sheer numbers, but the sheer longevity of its strike capability. So British carriers did have some issues with long-term strikes, maintaining long-term strikes because of the size of their expanded air groups, and even US ships had to pull back every once in a while for refueling and reammunitioning. The main thing, because of the square cube law with the Habakkuk, is that it's just going to keep going and going and going and going. It's going to have so much in terms of ammunition and fuel aboard. It's probably actually going to be acting as a mothership to other carriers as well as its escorts and so forth. So it's just going to be able to keep up a relentless pressure, and it can probably carry so many spare aircraft and or larger aircraft that its actual flyable air group probably isn't going to diminish for a long time as well. It's going to take a while to get there, though. Alan Schumacher asks, at what point does it make sense to use a high explosive shell against a target over a semi or armour-piercing shell? I can easily imagine holes being punched into unarmoured ships, but I wonder if a 16-inch HE shell would have been better against a light cruiser, or if an AP shell would still be better for maximum damage. I think when it comes to HE, and this is assuming using base-fused HE, because nose-fused HE has much more limited uses, but assuming you're using the base-fused version, I think it comes down to two potential scenarios. One where the target is far too lightly armoured, but also one where the target is far too heavily armoured. So if you're going after, let's say you're using a battleship's guns, and you're going after a destroyer, you want to use HE, because as you see at the Battle of Smart, AP shells just go straight through. If you're going after a cruiser, it's going to depend, I think, on the size and protection of that cruiser. So again, assuming you're in World War II, if you're going after something like your Hagi or a Königsberg, or maybe a Dido or an Arethusa, or maybe an old C or D class, something like that, or an Omaha, then you probably want to use HE, because protection is relatively minimal. Yes, the shell will explode almost instantly, but it's almost certainly going to punch relatively far into the ship, at least beyond the outer hull, and when it explodes, obviously massive explosion, very bad for the ship. If you're going up against something that's got substantially more protection, something like, say, USS Wichita, or an upgraded County class, or a Zara, then you want to go for an AP shell, and obviously anything bigger than that for battleships. The flip side of that is if you have small guns. Now, not all destroyers carried anything other than HE, although there were some destroyer guns that did have either some form of, even if it wasn't necessarily armour-piercing, at least semi-armour piercing, and the same thing with light cruiser guns, 5-inch and 6-inch guns. And some of those 5-inch guns might also be the same thing you find on destroyers. But anyway, if you have some form of armour-piercing or semi-armour-piercing shell at lower calibers, then you want to use that against other ships of approximately your weight class or slightly higher, where you need that to punch through the armour, and your shells have a realistic chance of punching through the armour. So if you have one of the heavier destroyer guns that has some form of semi-armour piercing shell, you might use that against one of the smaller light cruisers that we mentioned before. But against destroyers which are unarmoured, you might as well use your HE. And similarly, if you are in a 6-inch or 5-inch or 5.25-inch or whatever armed light cruiser. Again, you would probably use your armor piercing or semi-armor piercing against similar targets, but you've got slightly more punch, so maybe you'd use that against anything up to and including some of the heavy cruisers, something like a Pensacola, for example. You'd quite happily use that against. And depending on the range, maybe against some of the slightly better protected heavy cruisers, but not anything greater. The thing is, once you get up to a size or protection that's too great, so for destroyers that's probably anything sort of vaguely treaty cruiser-ish and up, and for cruisers that's probably the more well-protected treaty cruisers, and definitely anything above that, then when your armor piercing has relatively little chance of getting through anything, then you might as well go for HE, because if you're not getting through the armor, well, HE, AP or semi-AP, they're all going to explode outside, but the HE does the most bang. And so, like with what happened with Hiei in the first night action up Guadalcanal, you can sort of spray soup the structure and other unarmoured bits of the ship and try and break something important. And that brings us to the end of the Drydock for this week. So just a couple of small bits of channel admin. Most people have indicated that they would prefer the higher quality poster paper when it comes down to it, considering that the price difference is not all that much. So of course I will honour that. It's just a matter of getting some of the digital files all in good order, testing, prototyping, and then hopefully, at least with COVID restrictions being gradually lifted on, it appears at the moment, on schedule in the UK, posting won't be too much of a problem. But I will preview the various pictures that you will find on those posters at some point in the future when everything's ready to go to print. So don't worry, you don't have to worry about missing the announcement. And of course, exciting news just in, although to be fair, it's released on Thursday this week, so by the time you're listening to this it's either 2 or 3 days old, but USS Johnston has been found. Remember previously they thought they'd found some traces of her? They now found the actual ship, or most of it, and well, it's setting records once again, because we're now finding the ship at over 21,000 feet down, which, as far as I can tell, makes it pretty much the deepest shipwreck that anybody knows of. So, Johnston is still being defiant and special, even decades after she sank. That's it for today then. Thank you very much for listening. See you again in another video.